Right now for Sony shooters, there's two products that are hotly anticipated and a lot of people are waiting for the announcement from Sony for. The first is an APS-C camera, the Sony A7SIII, which is being billed as basically being like a baby A9. Probably trying to take the fight to Canon and Nikon's flagship APS-C DSLRs before they get replaced, namely the 7D Mark II and the D500. But that's not the one I want to discuss today. Today I want to talk about the Sony A7S III. Because I think whether you're a Sony shooter or not, and to be honest, even if you're a video shooter or not, there's probably got to be some degree of interest for you around the A7S III, considering how much hype is being built up about it, with Sony seemingly postponing the expected release date of the camera from late last year to potentially end of this month, because they wanted to take the camera even further. And with Sony also making statements like they want the camera to go beyond the expectations of everybody, which could be quite interesting because having read the rumors and what people are hoping for, there's quite a lot being expected. Now, while it's all well and good for Sony to say that they want to kind of exceed everybody's expectations, and that is the sort of thing that we would hope for, there is also some degree of reality that we have to keep here, and obviously not everything is possible in this world. So I don't actually think the A7S III is going to be as good as some people hope for. I'm not saying that it's going to be a bad camera. You know, the A7Ss have always been fantastic video cameras. But I think we do have to try and have some degree of realism here, and I think that there's probably going to be some people who are going to be a little bit disappointed with this camera. I hope I'm wrong. I would absolutely love to see a camera made with the specs that some people are talking about, but I don't think it's likely for this camera. So here are some of the specs that I've seen people throwing around as to what they hope the A7S III is going to be. And here's what I also think realistically the A7S III is going to be and why I think it's going to be that. Firstly, the resolution. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Sony confirmed that they've developed two new 8K capable sensors, a 36 and a 60 megapixel. So there's rumors that that 36 megapixel 8K sensor is going to be used in the A7S III. And according to Sony, that sensor is capable of shooting 4K up to 480 frames a second. I don't think either of those are likely, in all fairness, for one specific reason: heat management. Now, the A7 III, the A7R III, and the A9 all share pretty much the same fundamental body, the same fundamental chassis. And I expect to see the same thing in the A7S III. So I think we're going to see pretty much the same form factor in the S3 as we've currently got in the R3, the 3, and the 9. Where I think that presents a problem is the processing power required for the camera to be able to handle 8K and 4K of 480 frames a second. Now, I know there was speculation that the reason why Sony had postponed the original launch date of the A7S III was to improve the heat management. So the A7 III takes 6K 24 megapixel footage, it downsamples that to 4K at 30 frames a second, and that can handle about 90 minutes before that overheats. The A7R III downsamples 5K to 4K, that overheats in the end as well, although I think it lasts slightly longer than the A7 III. I believe the A9 also overheats, but I don't know what that does in terms of oversampling or not. However, if those current cameras can only manage an hour and a half, 2 hours at 30 frames a second before they overheat, then to get 480 frames a second out of the A7S III is probably going to need a liquid nitrogen cooler. So 36 megapixel sensor, an 8K, I think might be pushing it for the A7S III. I think maybe Sony are going to revamp the 12 megapixel sensor that they were using in the S2, maybe make it a stack sensor like we see in the A9 to handle faster throughput. And with a 12 megapixel sensor, you'd be able to handle 4K video, and I think 4K at 120 frames a second. I think if you consider at the minute that the fastest frame rates from a full frame camera that I can think of at least are 60 frames a second from the Canon 1DX Mark II and the new Panasonic S1 and S1R. So I think 120 frames a second is still much better than anything else on the market, is still perfectly usable. I think it's more realistic, and I think with a stack sensor and with some tweaks to the heat management, it's far more realistic that the camera body could be able to handle that. Now, something else that a lot of people mention as well is the ability of 10-bit internal recording. Now, Sony's current cameras can only shoot 8-bit internal. The competition currently, the Canon EOS R and the Nikon Z6 and Z7 are capable of 10-bit recording, but only through an external recorder. I don't know if the Panasonic S1 and S1R can do 10-bit internal or not. There's no mention of that. So I think if Sony can bring in 10-bit internal into the A7S III, that would certainly be a step up from everybody else as well. Autofocus wise, a lot of people are hoping that the A7S III has better autofocus than the A7S II. This makes logical sense that Sony are going to do that, because every camera in their lineup, moving from the second generation to the third, had vastly improved autofocus capabilities. The A9, A7R III, and then the A7 III all had fundamentally much better autofocus than they had in previous cameras. So it makes perfect sense that the A7S III will get a better autofocus system. I've seen people say that they want it to have the A9's autofocus system. I don't think mirrorless cameras actually work in that way. They're not like DSLRs, because the autofocus is incorporated into the sensor. So it's not like you really have an autofocus system. It's the sensor itself. So unless it's using the A9 sensor, it's not really going to have the A9 autofocus system. Might have a similar number of points, but it's fundamentally a different system. So I think if my theory of using a different sensor to the A9 is correct, then the autofocus system is going to be different. However, I'm in no doubt that the autofocus system on the A7S III will be far superior to that of the previous A7Ss. And then the big one for video shooters is the inclusion of a vari-angle LCD screen. And I'll be honest, I would love to see Sony start including vari-angle LCDs on their cameras, because it would make my life a whole lot easier. However, going back to the same issue to begin with, that I think the A7S III is going to use the same fundamental body design as the A7R III and the A7 III, they don't have a vari-angle LCD screen. Yes, they could modify the body to incorporate an LCD screen. However, I'm not sure if they will on this particular body. What I think they will more than likely do is stick with the same design they've currently got on the A7 series cameras, with just the tilting screen, not the fully articulated, which I know is going to annoy some people. But I think they will stick with the same design that they currently have. When they move on to the next generation of cameras, presumably with the A9 Mark II first, I think we will see a redesign of the camera body. Maybe a slightly enlarged body to allow for even better heat management, to be able to push that 8K or the super fast frame rate 4K. And also maybe the inclusion of an articulating screen. And then that chassis design can kind of filter down through the fourth generation of the A7 cameras. So yeah, those are my predictions. I think we will still see a low resolution camera for better noise performance in video. I think won't see more than 4K, but I do think we will see very high frame rates, hopefully 10-bit internal. I don't think we're going to see a vari-angle LCD as much as I would love to. But those are just my thoughts and predictions. What do you think the A7S III is going to include? Do you reckon I've gone a little bit too low? Do you reckon I've gone too high? Do you reckon I'm just about right? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.